Hi, my name is ReVerse Butcher, and I am a VR artist and poet currently based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been working on an ongoing series of artworks called the Circle series since about 2018. 3 of these Circle series works have won the Best in Digital Art Award at the Queensland XR Festival over the last 3 years, which was a huge honor. But what is the Circle series even about? The visual idea was simple. I wanted to make a series of linked, figurative artworks that explored the complexities of the human form. I chose the motif of a circle to place each artwork clearly in the same creative trajectory. Circles as a visual metaphor speak to the idea of inclusion and exclusion, permutation, and cycles. I also wanted to explore how working across different technical processes and mediums might inform different iterations, or remixes, of the work. A circle leans into the idea of repetition, but I don't believe that anything can ever be repeated exactly. By creating an artwork that starts as an illustration, includes a poem, becomes a virtual sculpture, a traditional painting, a digital illustration, an AR installation, and then a short film, the technical limitations of creating each remix forced me to think deeply about the most effective ways to visit and revisit the meaning of the work. How best to share it with you? If it means more as a painting on a canvas, or as a projection on a wall. As the idea progresses through each technical iteration, through de- and reconstruction, anomalies are going to occur with each permutation. I believe that's where breakthroughs occur. The introduction of VR to my creative pipeline in 2018 shifted how I thought about space, time, and what was possible for future-facing art experiences, but it did not negate my love of traditional methods and materials. But in using VR as a fine artist, I am intentionally occupying the space between the classical and the future-facing, 2 categories famously uncomfortable with each other. As a queer and female artist, I'm focused on disrupting the established patriarchal power dynamic between the seer and the seeing. By exploring figurative artworks, I wanted to think deeply about embodiment, what it means to me to inhabit this particular kind of body, what bodies mean, how they are co-opted, how they are embraced. The paradox of creating virtual sculptures are that these are bodies that are structurally formed, yet have no physical matter. But should that matter? I want you, the audience, to think about what it means to be embodied, what it means to be in a position to be able to define what reality even is. And it is always about what is included and excluded. It's important to celebrate and explore diverse representations of the human body. As a queer and female artist, my body, and bodies like mine, are more likely to be on display, in a way historically defined by cis men. The feminine has long been the subject of the art, with the art objects that we make being underrepresented and undervalued. I think it's important to disrupt this hierarchy by acknowledging and representing the female gaze, feminine desire, revulsion, fear, joy, and power. You are not just looking at these sculptures. They're looking right back at you too, and they will not lower their eyes first. But as the Circle series works have one foot in both worlds, traditional and digital, they fit functionally everywhere, and technically nowhere. Traditional art institutions are often suspicious of digital works, and the fight for their recognition as fine artworks and inclusion in wider exhibition programs is met with issues around their definition and value. The polarizing explosion and implosion of NFTs, and the confusing overwhelm presented by the sheer speed of AI has, in my experience anyway, created a cultural climate where, if any part of a work is digitally native, many local traditional institutions will exclude it because of either unstated bias, a lack of technical understanding, or a fear-based approach to what might be seen by some as a threat to the value and status of more traditional artworks and approaches. Artists are often not amazing at selling their own work or making it understood, and that shouldn't be held as the measure of an artist's work. But as working artists, we are supposed to be thinking about the spaces that can hold or share our works. Galleries, festivals, exhibition spaces, auction houses, museums, private collections, etc. And while obviously these physical spaces are incredibly important, I think it's almost more important to think across time. One of my heroes was a Swedish painter called Hilma af Klint. Now, she died in 1944, and her style was abstract, not figurative. But, knowing that her work would not be understood by her peers or the patriarchy, she stated in her will that her work, over 1,200 paintings, 100 texts, and 26,000 pages of notes, should be kept out of the public eye until at least 20 years after her death. Well, 80 years later in 2023, and she's being celebrated as one of the very first visionary abstract artists. I wonder what she would have made of VR. I think as future-facing artists, we must remain true to our vision. We must continue to experiment and share, even if the space to do so is not always open to us yet. And we need to think strategically and not focus on the commerciality. We need to be a little bit more like Hilma, and maybe a little bit less like, say, Hearst. Physical spaces are obviously important, but with the spatial internet in its infancy, we're about to see an explosion of another kind of unreal estate, the metaverse. It's hypothetical, and it's not. It's cellular, and it's not. It's real, and it isn't. It's layered, and it's not. And it's social and deeply personal, all at the same time. There's hardly any legislation written about it, how and who can own it, how it can be used, and how much it is allowed to interact with existing physical environments before there's gonna be a problem. We haven't even really worked out what it is yet, and here I am, reporting to you now from inside one in 2023. But I wonder what it will look like in 2053. Eventually, digital and XR artworks will gain ground in more traditional spaces too. My Circle Series project is working on a theory of flexible delivery, and this is intentional. It is a way of future-proofing itself. By being flexible across file formats and exhibition options, it makes the most of current opportunities. And by being highly remixable, it opens itself to future iterations as legacy medias transition out of use and are replaced by new media yet to be invented. And with each remix, each iteration, each permutation, the idea develops further, and more breakthroughs are possible. I'm preparing for hindsight. Ask me about it again in another 20 years. There have been roadblocks and misconceptions about my works because they use digital processes, mostly the suspicion that they were created with AI. And no shade to AI artworks either. It's just a different genre and not one where my expertise is at. But there is an ugly assumption that anyone creating digitally just pops in some parameters and the computer just magically does it all for you. But any digital artist, including AI artists, will tell you that every digital creator must almost invent their own creative pipelines, sometimes writing, testing, patching, or bending existing softwares, writing code, experimenting, and discovering new uses for old and new tech. A lot of digital creators are inventors and polymaths. There are huge international networks for professionals and enthusiasts who often do not know each other personally, who have never met, who are united by a certain type of intelligence and a common interest, who learn more by working together and sharing what they are learning and making. These communities are the ones that it makes the most sense for me to collaborate with right now. They're open, they're excited, and they're creating work that constantly blows my mind. I always feel like I'm in good company. These communities are living proof that digital creators have highly skilled processes that are simply just not recognized by more traditional art institutions yet. Fine artworks that use digital processes seem, to me anyway, to be being dismissed as technical artworks by the establishment. The way I see it, the main difference between digital fine artworks and technical artworks is optimization. Fine artworks using digital processes are not necessarily trying to be video games, though they might use video game engines or tools creatively in alternative ways. Fine artworks may not necessarily be focused on things like optimization. My fine artworks, at least, are made with the idea of one-of-ones, or performances, or immersive experiences and exhibitions in mind. They're aimed at a different demographic. In my own experience, fine artworks are not concerned with making creative compromises to minimize stress on a user's computer as its first consideration. Fine artworks are more concerned with cultural meaning, how meaning is made. Fine artworks have other creative, cultural, and technical considerations much higher up the ladder than optimization, corporate ownership, or marketability. As a fine artist, I may be using some of the same tools that technical or game artists might use, like VR headsets or Unreal Engine or VR chat, but I think a huge distinction lies in the intent of the work. And don't get me wrong, technical artists are essential. I do not wish to undervalue their work. Without them, literally nothing would function. Their fingerprints are everywhere, designing and underwriting everything from, yes, games, but also architecture, software, hardware, automobiles, clothing, schematics of all kinds. Literally nothing would exist or function without that very specific, very intentional, very efficient application of imagination to problem solving. So let's make sure that they get their due. I don't think that a binary good, bad, better, worse dichotomy is helpful, so let's just say that there are different functions, skill sets, and intentions at work here, and that's okay. But the establishment loves a good set of selection criteria, and only really exists because of its power to define and delineate. It wants to be the one with the loudest voice to make and control cultural meaning. Boring. Well, I argue that so can we, if enough of us do it well enough, weirdly enough, and for long enough. As technology develops, and it develops fast, any work using digital processes becomes dated. For instance, this avatar's movements are kinda janky because of the inside-out tracking on my headset. My facial expression and visemes aren't very nuanced. However, what this avatar and my headset can do is allow for a kind of immersion not possible or accessible previously. It is simply the best we can do for now. And there is also some merit in accepting that this will place a work in a continuum of developing technologies. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Looking natural or photoreal is not my intention here. Why should things look photoreal? What's so wrong with the uncanny valley? Trying to make something look more human than human is likely always going to fail. Sometimes the best way to express the human is with a touch of the surreal. One of our powers as human beings is critical thinking, in how we are able to interpret things, to make and evaluate meaning. Real-time VR experiences are not going to have the same effects possible that productions that have been rendered and gone through post-processing or post-production are going to have. But there is also not as much chance in a passive VR experience for experimentation, discovery, or surprise. All the possible outcomes have already been computed, and anything outside those boundaries simply just doesn't exist. In real-time or active VR experiences, there are obviously still boundaries, but there are more variables and more ways to experiment with what is possible individually inside the experience. The effects may be less photoreal, but they have a delicious unpredictability to them, and in my experience, that often can feel a lot more human. If I require a technical quality to something, I'll render it, and I'll turn it into a video. This will make sure that what I am trying to show is consistently deliverable, it's accessible, and it has less variables between me and the viewer that could potentially malfunction. Being open to tech, in my experience anyway, has required me to be flexible and open to remixing and reworking a creative idea. And I think this makes me a stronger artist. Ideas are the same way. They don't and can't stay static and remain powerful. Maybe the key to relating to all this is that in different contexts, we should hold different expectations for project delivery, creative outcomes, and tech. We should think about what we want to achieve and the best tool available at that moment in time, knowing that it will change in another moment of time, and that moment in time is definitely on its way. So, in the spirit of letting joy be my rebellion, and to help myself think outside the box of how I might exhibit my new media artworks in future-facing venues, I took a set of 6 of my Circle Series virtual sculptures, and I made an original 1-hour immersive VR art experience for Kaleidosky. Kaleidosky is a unique and vibrant live VR music venue. They host a regular weekly event, but they organized a special event called the VR Art and Culture Expo for the week that I presented the Circle Series at Kaleidosky. Focusing on acts that had a live, original, or slightly experimental element to them, Ru booked a diverse lineup of everything from singers to dancers using full-body tracking, live visuals, live modular synth performances, beatboxers, as well as DJs, VJs, and even a VR muralist. This special event went for well over 8 hours and featured acts from all over the USA, Japan, and Australia. I felt really honored to be included in such exceptional company. So, now you know a little more about the philosophy, challenges, and the cultural landscape facing XR fine artists. So I'm going to share a little more about the technical process of how I make my work with you now. I'll explain a little more about how I make the original finished fine artworks, and I'll also show you a little more about the theory and practice about how I remixed it for Kaleidosky. So let's take a look behind the curtain, shall we? So I'll begin with designing a pose in the scene for the virtual sculpture. I'll work out how the figure will interact with the circle or circles in the scene. I'll think about a visual narrative. I'll think about the symbolism, what I want to make, and how I want that to make me and others feel. During the pandemic, I taught myself how to use DAZ 3D to pose reference models. Prior to that, I just started going to life drawing classes, but that got nixed for a couple of quarantine years. I found that I had more power over the stories that these sculptures could tell if I could design all the parameters, and I liked that process more, too. When making a reference model, I pay special attention to the little details and imperfections. It helps realism ring true. Faces are unique. They're almost never symmetrical. Ears are also unique. They're just like fingerprints. It's always been the fine detail that drives my work. I always pay close attention to the center of gravity, within the pose as well. This makes sure that the end sculpt looks like it's interacting with the natural world. I do try to make sure that I'm portraying a diverse range of human forms. However, I also do usually focus on the feminine form because personally I just find it more compelling and interesting. There are also way too many sculptures of cis men out there in the world. They don't need me to help them out with that. Using the finished 3D reference model, I'll create a few simple 3D renders of the mannequin using the Adobe Substance Suite. These images help me to do mock-ups and lighting plans. They help me to consider the finished pose and next steps. Whether that is a VR sculpt, a traditional painting, a digital illustration, etc. That 3D reference model and any illustrations that I might have made go into Tilt Brush with me to inform the VR sculpt. I'll build up the sculpture by hand in small shapes and pieces that interconnect. The sculpting process itself is a bit like building a mosaic or a collage. And collage is one of my main traditional art practices, so this method of sculpting is a kind of transferable skill. I think it's important for people to know that I am building the finished sculpture with my hands and controllers, and there are a lot of commonalities with traditional sculpting in this process. But I don't always work in a linear way. I don't get to start at the head and finish at the toes. But this sculpting process is where I get to make the bulk of my most exciting creative choices. While sculpting eyelashes, I can make them the size of a wardrobe while I'm working on them, and then shrink them all back down again. Muscles can be the size of mountains. The body itself becomes a landscape. It's a profound feeling. I feel both embodied and disembodied. I'm floating in space while thinking really hard about gravity and sculpting frozen motion on a head the size of a truck. The capacity to play with scale means that my addiction to fine detail can really be expressed down to the lines on a palm. every single hair is sculpted by hand. And it feels really natural to build, form, and reposition using my hands and controllers. Once the virtual sculpture is complete, I export it from VR and do the cleanup and organization in Nomad Sculpt for iPad. Using an iPad sculpting app allows me to continue to work intuitively with my hands and an Apple Pencil. After this is all finished, I'll create and choose a set of handmade textures. I make these using a mix of traditional techniques and materials like vintage papers, acrylic paints, inks, watercolors, and other mixed medias. I'll use my iPhone to photograph them in high resolutions, and Photoshop or Procreate for iPad to create Vispo or further layered remixes. Sometimes I'll collage or blend different pages or elements. Sometimes I'll highlight layers and play with distance by creating shadows digitally, so that when they're translated into SBSAR materials using the Adobe Substance Suite, they'll appear more 3D. During this process, I pay special attention to the power that color schemes and juxtapositions have. Are they harmonious? What conflict or emotional message am I trying to portray? Using the Adobe Substance Suite, I'll put together a final series of 3D renders. I'll test, and I'll make final creative decisions regarding texture placements. I'll finesse the lighting designs. Usually, I'll export between 3 and 10 different virtual photographs or 3D renders, and these can be used for physical prints. I'll also create a GLB file during this step to make the artwork augmented reality ready. After that, I'll import the finished sculpture into Unreal Engine to make a cinematic from it. I'll use the materials editor and visual scripting to build up the textures from the JPEGs I exported earlier when I made my handmade textures with the Adobe Substance Suite. Then I'll use Unreal Engine's filmmaking toolset to create cinematic videos for exhibition, sale, and remixing. This involves positioning and animating lighting, cameras, and other interactive elements in the scene using keyframes and a timeline. During the process of creating a cinematic video, I'll compose a soundtrack using Virtuoso VR. This is another intuitive, hands-on process that makes use of a virtual reality environment. I've found it similar enough to the organic methods of making music to easily transfer my musical and performance skills in inventive ways. But it's also broadened what is possible by making virtual synths and instruments available in virtual space. I can compose and record almost anywhere, and there are no noise complaints because the sound is going through headphones. I don't have studio fees or the issue of transporting large amounts of equipment between physical spaces, and the environment within the app remains the same once you've set it up the way you like it and saved it. I need less collaboration or input from others, and I much prefer to have less interference in this stage of the process. But I still have the capacity to import helm patches and samples and the capacity to edit and bend and alter existing sounds while playing them. I feel like working in a VR environment doesn't really take one that far away from the physical feeling of making live, improvised music that I really love. Frankly, I wish this instrument existed 20 years ago. Once video is exported from Unreal Engine and the soundtrack is recorded from Virtuoso VR, I use Adobe Premiere Pro to knit together the final video artworks, short films, video poems, etc. Once a finished iteration of a fine artwork is fleshed out, I'll approach designing a remix by considering the constraints and parameters of the new context or format that I'll be using. I'll think carefully about how the original idea and artwork might translate across formats. and how I can use format-specific strengths and avoid weaknesses to make something thoughtful and meaningful. For my Circle series remix for Kaleidosky, I knew that the set was going to be 1 hour long. I knew that it was being broadcast in VR chat. I knew that it would mean that I could collaborate with an existing scene of artists and musicians who were already proactive VR users. I knew from the jump that to make the most of Ru's incredible world design and Tera's amazing build, that video and music were going to be both the most striking and the most efficient way to exhibit my works, rather than as a sculptural installation. The power and the artistry of Ru and Tera's Kaleidosky world design and build lies in its giant sky dome. Using any video input signal, the Kaleidosky does what it says on the box. Using a staff control panel, one can use the inbuilt video feedbacking tools to project various types of kaleidoscopic effects on the video output on a massive scale. Basically, the sky explodes with kaleidoscopic color and constantly fracturing geometric patterns, and you control the patterns in real time. The scale of the experience from the inside is overwhelmingly and utterly beautiful. The first time I experienced it while watching somebody else's show, I was viscerally moved, and I got a little emotional. I also got inspired and started thinking about what I might be able to offer such a space and its regular audience. I also started thinking about how I could make sure that I could share the power and the poignancy of this kind of experience with people who weren't necessarily regular VR users, as well as the ones who were regularly plugging themselves in. I decided to film the show from inside the VR environment, using the in-app VR chat camera system. Making this kind of extra content isn't even an unusual tactic to ensure accessibility. These events are happening every weekend, and many artists are already incorporating live streaming or video on demand in the same ways that physically based concerts often release official videos or even bootlegs captured by fans. I am so keen to hear about how you came up with the idea for the Kaleidosky. It's such a beautiful venue, and the community that has grown around it is so lovely and so welcoming and so inclusive, and I just want to hear about how you came up with that dream and how you realized it together with your community.
Absolutely. It came when we were in Neos. I want to make sure I give proper credit to Circuitry, the gentleman who created one of the original Kaleidosky models in Neos and left it there for people to play around with and say, take this and do what you will. What kind of things can you come up with? Just kind of a neat thing. And then I immediately had this idea of, why is this thing tiny right here? I want this to be gigantic and around me. Like, this would be so cool if I could do that. But I wonder if there's more types of this we can do. And so we began to workshop in Neos.
Okay, and Neos is another platform.
Yes. Neos and Resonite are two programs that were made by Fructious. They are basically VR sandbox applications with Unity in VR, basically. So it allows for group collaborative efforts on collaborative builds and things like that directly in VR rather than separately and out of Unity, which is very empowering. So it allows individuals, especially developers, to sit down together and work on a project or an idea or generate something. And it's very, very, very good for that. Any update you make doesn't require a push from Unity out to it's click, I'm done. It's as easy as that. My idea initially was, a cross pattern to, because I've been looking at a lot of different venues and looked at venue design, how if you create a little box, people will go into that box. They just want to go into it sometimes. Dancers especially and other things, but like the design of the venue is purposeful to where there's areas for people to go to, do different things, or separate from the main group, main area, but all of them, to get to another area, you have to pass through the center. Everything, wanted to bring everything back to the center, to the yards, but still give people a chance to kind of expand out a little bit to each side. That's why it's in the shape that it is in, because it tends to I want to keep bringing people back to the center to at least cross through each other, interact with each other, and pass through, or but without necessarily telling them, hurting them, through there. But, working on that space and then putting it in the middle of the kaleidoscope. This was all, the genesis of the idea of Kaleidosky in here before building it over in VR chat.
Okay.
Seeing what worked over there and then testing it and then coming over here and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. And that's when I partnered with Tera, because without her, the world would not exist in any form. There is so much required of coding, optimization, and building, and things that I don't understand in Unity. I have always said collaboration builds better things, because those models, I had help making those with Tatsi and Hidi. Tera has built every single bit of the coding and the underpinnings and, under the hood of that car. And it runs like a dream because of her absolute brilliance at it.
Yeah.
Period. And that collaboration is really what produced Kaleidosky.
Oh, that's a beautiful story. I really love the idea of how you were all able to sort of take it through different iterations, through different platforms, and carry this idea of bringing people together and having this beautiful sky. That is absolutely lovely. When I started building my remixed set, I decided to break the 60-minute duration into 6 10-minute sections or cycles. That way, I could present 6 Circle Series artworks and exhibit a range of works made across the last 3 years. I chose 3 of the most recognizable and previously awarded Circle Series artworks: Feminine with Vacant Grasp, Feminine with Corroded Code, and Feminine with Climb. I paired those with 3 newer Circle Series works: Feminine with Well-Known Story, Feminine with Perfect Unbalance, and Feminine with Hooked Finger. While longer cinematic videos were rendering out of Unreal Engine, I started composing and recording 6 new 10-minute original music tracks in Virtuoso VR. This process took weeks, testing and bending synth sounds and building loops. But it had been the first time in years that I had set out to write enough cohesive music tracks for a full hour. It reminded me of just how much I missed focusing on playing music, and it's really inspired me to challenge myself to do longer form works more often. I also reached out to my good friend, guitarist and experimental musician Roger Alsop to see if he wanted to contribute as a guest on one of the 6 tracks. Roger and I have played live gigs together at a residency called Collage here in Melbourne, and we've worked together on a number of projects since then. Roger also wrote the haunting soundtrack for my earlier project, The Virtual Circle. It's always been concerned with motion and temporality, and I always enjoy hearing how he responds to my work. The old logo remains on windows and signs, VR, for Victorian Railways. It has a double meaning for me. He never plays exactly what most might expect, and it always makes me think outside the box. It is not lost on me that, while trying to leave Australia forever, we wound up staying very still in a place that was designed to be permanently transitory. But the Grand is host to 150 years of historical movement. It's a perfect schism, Roger and I collaborated remotely on the track for Feminine with Corroded Code. He described his process to me as playing the video and music track that I sent him, and recording 5 different options in rapid succession on his guitar while responding to the artwork. Each of the 5 options he recorded were very different, and each held validity. However, Roger left the creative control regarding the choices of what to include and how to mix it all together to me. What I adore about Roger's contribution to this track is that it's largely textural, and it doesn't pander to the more conservative expectations of melodic territory. When you listen to it, you'd be hard-pressed to pick what instrument it was actually played on. Brilliant. I love that. The parts of the track that sound more like a psychedelic glissando guitar are actually sounds made and bent in Virtuoso VR. The growling hums that one might associate with a dark and dirty synth sound came organically from his electric guitar. Wonderful. Here's a little clip of how I merged Roger's contribution to what I had already written on Feminine with Corroded Code. So this is just his section. I've isolated that so I can go through and pull certain notes and textures out of his contributions. You can see here how audio 3, which is this one here, is the one coming through right now, and I've muted all of the others, or I've muted top 2 and the bottom line of audio. So now we'll have a bit of A5 come in. You can see there's sort of that higher note, and it might actually need to be pushed a little higher. So we'll make it a 3. Yep. So this is going to be playing underneath or fitting in and around what I've already composed, and we'll play that through in just one moment. We're going to add a keyframe here. See where it fades down in this section. So on audio 5, we're going to hit keyframe, and we're going to go there and hit another keyframe and pull it all the way down to nothing, so that when it hits that, it appears to stop. Cool. Let's listen to that transition. Very atmospheric. Roger, very atmospheric. You've got that deep, dark hum. Okay, let's add in what I had already composed, so we'll see how they all blend together. So I'm going to unmute audio 1, go to the beginning. Here we go. I found that, for now at least, video was the most accessible and effective way of presenting these kinds of new media artworks. An institutional lack of access to XR equipment, or an understanding and willingness to try, has been a genuine barrier to address as an XR fine artist. Tech-based festivals like this one, and online XR environments like Kaleidosky have been, in my experience anyway, far more willing to accept and celebrate experimental fine art than fine art traditional institutions are willing to embrace or expand their use of tech. However, film or video seems to be an acceptable bridge between the two worlds, for right now. Most galleries will have a projector or a screen at the very least, and XR environments will have video as their lowest bar for entry. There is very little that is challenging for audiences with video as a format. It can be engaged with easily from even a mobile device. I feel like developing a sense of flexibility and the capacity to defy definition, the slipping between definitions, might actually be a defining feature and common experience of queerness. The idea of fitting in nowhere and still going, "Everywhere we damn well please, thank you very much," is familiar ground to me. I can't speak for others, but it's certainly been my experience with XR environments that I find myself surrounded by other queer or queer-friendly collaborators. While working with the Kaleidosky crew, I did not find myself outnumbered by straight cis men. A refreshing change from working in and around the traditional music and arts industries. It's amazing, and I feel like it's allowed me to do some of my very best work. Presenting work in VR has the added benefit that you can perform for an international audience without plane fares, and you can collaborate across time zones. As a queer woman who has worked in the arts across a couple decades, let me tell you, it is amazing. Amazing to just be able to block a jerk that comes out of nowhere to mess with you. I'm not going to say that all VR spaces are a complete utopia where you never get anyone hassling you or being inappropriate ever. That is, of course, just not true. This is the internet. But there are tools in place that can really improve the safety of your experience. Because these spaces are safer, and one can express oneself without the risk of actual violence, I've noticed that many people feel freer and are able to present themselves imaginatively, playfully, joyfully, and authentically. And that can only do great things for one's creativity. I think it speaks for itself. So, let's let it speak for itself. Ladles and gentle friends, this is Kaleidosky.